Ladies and gentlemen, are we live? Welcome to Black Sunday Readings. I'm your favorite Asian robot, and of course my dear co-star is here. Please enjoy our creepy backgrounds while we tell the rest of the world that we are live. You might see her Discord for a moment, because what I'm doing is I'm actually just getting the reading here. Right. That should be fantastic. So, the first story that we're going to read is going to be called Slithers. Now, we will read this story for you in a moment, but I am going to post a link to some of my friends first, and then Wonderfen and I will read for you some of the creepiest tales we have. Let me just link my friends. Copy link. And paste. Come listen to scare. Alright, so there is our little Black Sunday reading. And of course, you have to give me a moment. I just intend to share my screen. Watch our creepy horror story reading. I'm sure most people will enjoy this now. Excellent. Right. So the first story we have for you tonight is a story called Slithers. I am just going to add a bit of text so that everyone can read that. Call it Slithers. And I'll make it scroll. So, where am I going to put this little bit of text? Well, right here. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is the story we are reading. I'm going to reduce the opacity of the words. Please enjoy this creepy tale on your Sunday night. Arthur had just come home from a week of restful camping with his two best friends. The three of them had been planning the trip for months in advance due to the ever-growing toxic work environment that was created by their new supervisor. Arthur was particularly excited when the three of them had planned the trip, mainly because going out into the woods had always put his mind at ease. When Arthur was a child, he would go on trips in the great outdoors with his father. The two of them would live off the land for a week or so, despite the fact that it would always make Arthur's mother worry sick about the two of them alone in the woods. Arthur could never understand what made his mother so worried when they would leave, because Arthur and his father would regularly take a trip into the woods every last week of July. The camping trip was planned to give Arthur a final sense of freedom before the school year started in September. The reason why they didn't take the trip in August was because the month was reserved for getting all the supplies and clothes Arthur would need for school, and the two of them wouldn't be able to plan anything for the month.
The final sense of freedom he felt when he and his father went on those trips is the reason he loved them so much. Arthur and his father would lie underneath the warm July night sky and point out the constellations as they appeared to them. Arthur's father would explain the stories behind the groups they found, being an avid stargazer. As the summer night would become darker, more constellations would present themselves to Arthur and his father, almost like they were becoming brave enough to fill the night sky with their presence and majesty. As a child, Arthur would always wonder why he could see each constellation so vividly when he and his father were out in the woods, as opposed to when he would look through his telescope at home. His childish self would think that the stars were too afraid of being seen by people to come out of the cities. In fact, he figured that the bright lights of the city were scaring them away. The notion that the stars were afraid of humans was a funny thought to the now 23-year-old Arthur, but sometimes he felt that living in the ignorance of youth on the topic might have been better.
Arthur entered his small studio apartment with a sigh of remorse as his mind started to fill with the overbearing reality of being an adult. Entering his cramped little living room, Arthur kicked off his muddy boots, causing them to launch off his feet and up against the door. Arthur threw his backpack onto his vomit-colored couch, nestled up in the corner against the two thin, tan-colored walls that made up part of his living space. The thought of being home was both refreshing and dismal at the same time, mainly because he never felt like this building was his home. He felt more at home out in the wilderness than he did in his apartment. The idea that Arthur felt more at home outside was a depressing thought, but he couldn't really do anything about that, except for what he would usually do when he felt this way. Arthur crossed the beige carpet and entered his kitchen to seek out what he now craved most dearly. Opening up the fridge, Arthur reached in and grabbed a cold bottle of his favorite beer from the side shelf before twisting the cap off. Arthur brought the cold bottle up to his anticipating lips, but stopped short after feeling a sudden pain on the front of his left leg. Small pricks of pain began to make its way up Arthur's leg, but it wasn't particularly a deep pain. Each spasm was more like a pinprick just below his kneecap that kept occurring every few seconds. Arthur quickly reached down to where the pain was originating from, but felt nothing against his fingertips except for his own smooth skin as he took a small sip from his bottle.
After Arthur got finished unpacking, he decided that it was time to get dinner ready. Although sometimes he hated to admit it, Arthur had a passion for cooking meals and baking that seemed to sprout from when he was in middle school. As Arthur began to collect the dishes required to make his evening meal, he started to feel the same quick pricks of pain he felt just a few minutes ago, and immediately started to rub his left leg in an attempt to discover what could be causing the discomfort. As Arthur began to trace the leg, the pain vanished as quickly as it began, causing Arthur to believe he must either have a splinter or maybe he must have banged his leg up while hiking last week. The thought of his leg being injured in the hike seemed a bit too hard to believe, considering he didn't remember running into anything that would cause any sort of leg injury. So Arthur dismissed the thought and continued preparing his meal. Small pricks in Arthur's leg continued far into the evening, even bothering him as he slept. Small pricks were unpredictable, starting at unknown intervals, but containing the same amount of annoying disturbance as the previous prick. However, due to some miracle, Arthur had only woken up 3 or 4 times during the night before he had to get up for work. Before getting up due to the high-pitched buzzing of his alarm, Arthur glanced over at his leg in order to inspect it. Inspecting as intently as he could, Arthur was unable to find any source of the pain he was feeling.
As the week dragged by, the pain in Arthur's leg continued to pester him. During the day and night, each prick of pain caused Arthur to rub the affected area. By the end of the first week, Arthur's leg began to get extremely irritated, causing his skin to burn and itch. Finally, Arthur got to a breaking point and realized he would need something to quell the irritation. So he tried applying a number of skin creams to the affected area, but to no avail. By the end of the second week, Arthur's leg got even worse. Even with the countless amount of creams he'd been applying to his skin, it wasn't enough to fix the irritation. At the beginning of the third week, Arthur was at his limit and couldn't take any more. He would have to see a doctor or risk sawing his leg off in order to quell the frustration. Arthur scheduled an appointment to see the doctor and showed up the next day to see if he could get any assistance with his problem. Due to the massive swelling on the affected area of Arthur's leg, the doctor couldn't determine the exact cause of the pain that Arthur was reporting. Although he figured that he might have been allergic to some of the plants in the forest, to help the swelling go down, the doctor prescribed an extra-strength ointment and suggested that Arthur should wrap the affected area in bandages before applying the ointment. The doctor told Arthur to wait until the affected area was healed and the swelling went down before coming back so they can do an X-ray to determine if he might have fractured or sprained something in his leg. If Arthur's leg didn't show any signs of healing, his doctor told him to see a dermatologist. But most importantly, the doctor told him not to scratch or rub the affected area to prevent the possibility of infection. Arthur rushed home as fast as he possibly could and charged through the door, slamming it behind him. Arthur ripped open the packaging and vigorously applied the cream to the raw skin around the affected areas. Arthur was quick to apply the cream to his skin, but as he was applying it, he felt something that caused him to jump in surprise. Running his hand over this area around his kneecap again caused him to feel a small intrusion coming from the outside of his skin that both shocked and relieved him. The discovery relieved him mostly because now he knew the source of the problem and could figure out a way to solve it.
The source of all his suffering must have been some sort of splinter or thorn, but Arthur found it a little odd that he wasn't able to discover it previously. Regardless, Arthur figured he should be able to pull it out, but was unsuccessful due to the size of the thorn and the fact that his fingers were too slick from the cream. Seeing as there wouldn't be any way to get the thorn out anytime soon, Arthur decided to wait until the cream did what it was supposed to, then work on getting it out later. After 3 days of torture, the swelling and an irritation in Arthur's leg finally subsided. Arthur was relieved to see his leg return to its normal size, but all throughout the time of healing, he felt that same pinprick he felt the day he got back from home every now and then. He felt like his suffering would be over soon, as he sat in front of his desk at work, waiting for his time to pack up and go.
It felt like an eternity of waiting, but after work was finally done and over with, Arthur hurried to the store in order to buy some tweezers. Arthur returned home with a fresh pair of tweezers in a plastic bag, and he ripped the tweezers out of the package and began to study the surface of his skin intently. After a short time of scanning, he finally found what looked like a very small intrusion slightly sticking out of his skin. The intrusion looked like a piece of black thorn that had been implanted after the body of the thorn had broken off. Despite the fact that Arthur's skin had healed from the swelling, there was still a lot of broken and blistered skin around the area of what looked like a thorn or splinter. As Arthur pressed the tweezers against the skin of his knee, he felt a wave of pain flow from the area, but he was determined to remove this nuisance once and for all. The tweezers clamped down on the piece of a possible thorn, and Arthur pulled softly, but the piece of thorn wouldn't slide out. It only slightly stretched like it was just another hair on his body. Arthur tried pulling even harder as he tried to ignore the rising pain shooting up from where he pulled, but his effort resulted in no visual change. Arthur paused briefly before he clamped the tweezers firmly on the intrusion, and pulled harder and harder as the pain in his leg ramped up tenfold, before he felt the thorn slightly move back with his effort.
The piece of thorn must have been a bit longer than Arthur had expected, because as he pulled, it only seemed to get longer. The thing that Arthur thought was a piece of thorn turned into something completely different and would only yield a few centimeters before halting and not budging. Arthur held his breath and clenched before yanking back with half the amount of force he was planning, before yelling out in pain and doubling over. Arthur looked at his leg, noticed the piece of thorn he was trying to pull out had seemed to be a lot longer than he expected. As Arthur sat there looking at the strange object protruding from his skin, he moved the tweezers closer and his eyes fixated on the point of the piece of thorn. But, to Arthur's horror, he noticed that what he thought was a piece of thorn or splinter began to quickly slither back into place on his knee.
Noticing what looked like some sort of tail moving into his body caused Arthur to scream the loudest he had ever screamed in his life. Arthur's eyes widened as he sat there, his eyes fixated on the strange protrusion wiggling its way back into position like a worm. The tail returned to its original position at the area just below his kneecap, slithering in till it looked like a small thorn again. Arthur sat there for what seemed like hours, and shocked. He felt shocked and confused at what had just happened. A flood of thoughts entered Arthur's mind as he decided to try what he should do in that situation. Arthur couldn't decide what would be the best course of action to take based on the situation. It was not like he could tell anyone. Who would believe him anyway? Arthur thought fast, and in a brash moment, he decided that whatever the thing slithering around in his body was needed to be pulled out now. By the time Arthur came to his decision, he was writhing in so much pain that he wouldn't be able to make it down to his car, let alone drive down to the hospital by himself. Arthur had no one to call to come pick him up. And so, he made a quick decision that would cut out whatever was taking residence inside his body and call 911 after he was finished to take him to the emergency room. Arthur crawled over to the kitchen slowly until he made it to the fridge. Arthur opened the fridge and reached up, grabbing a few bottles of beer and downing them quickly until he felt slightly woozy, and then crawled over to the small living room. Arthur sat in the middle of his living room and moved the tweezers onto the intrusion, reluctantly clamping the tweezers down and taking a deep breath. Arthur yanked back on the sliver-like intrusion, causing more to be exposed. Arthur cringed as he saw what looked like the black tail of a worm start to surface from his skin before pulling so hard that more of the creature was beginning to surface, as if it was pulled from its own burrow.
The skin around the intrusion began to bleed and break, causing Arthur to scream in agony. But he continued to pull the worm, causing his skin to rip in a line traveling in an upward direction in his leg. Arthur continued to scream in pain as salty streams of a cascade down his face, while he continued to pull, causing the breakage to continue upward, leaving a trail of broken skin filling up with warm blood. The worm emerged more as Arthur continued to pull, even though he was in excruciating pain, but he had to get this thing out. The line traveled farther and farther up as the worm emerged, tarring up Arthur's thigh and making it up the side of his stomach. His clothes and floor began to turn a deep crimson while he continued. Arthur's hands became slick as he pulled more, abandoning the tweezers a long time ago in order to uproot his invader faster.
Minutes ticked by as Arthur struggled to keep from passing out on his floor. Despite the limitation, Arthur continued on pulling, removing the creature inch by inch from his body. At this point, the line of breaking skin traveled from Arthur's kneecap up to his thigh, up to the side of his stomach and to his ribcage, winding up past his chest and up the side of his skull. The carpet was soaked thoroughly with Arthur's fresh and drying blood, as he sat there sobbing uncontrollably from the intense pain and the realization of where the creature's end might be. Arthur sat there looking down at himself in the large pooling puddle that soaked into the carpet as his wounds began to form clots in a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding. At this point, Arthur was starting to fade in and out of consciousness as his hand weakly gripped onto the creature's body. Pulling softly, Arthur began to push himself up onto his feet, stumbling into the kitchen, slipping and sliding on the tiles. Arthur made his way to the phone, propping himself up using the kitchen counter. Arthur dialed the number for emergency services and waited until he heard a woman's voice come over the phone, asking what the emergency was. Arthur tried to regain his composure, but found it extremely difficult with the amount of blood loss that was occurring.
The operator asked if anyone was on the line and said to state the emergency again, to which Arthur began to speak. He weakly told the operator to send help as he stumbled towards the living room and managed to tell her his address before collapsing onto the carpet, struggling to get up while the operator continued to ask him questions. He told the operator one more time his address and weakly said to send help as the phone dropped from his hand and he lay there on the carpet, fading in and out of consciousness as the last thing he heard was the operator telling him that a medical team will be there shortly. Arthur's vision began to get very blurry as he crawled over the carpet, his wounds being irritated by it as he dragged himself along. Arthur continued on for a little more until he could no longer keep himself from drifting off and collapsed on the floor of his living room.
Arthur started himself awake a few minutes later, weakly pulling himself onto his couch and breathing heavily as he surveyed the mess covering the room. Arthur glanced at the exposed worm-like creature twitching and coiling on the ground beside him. Sliding his hand up to the side of his skull, Arthur gripped onto the exposed part of the creature and was attached to him. And he brought up the tweezers to the exposed worm and clamped down hard, causing the rest of the worm to wiggle and twitch on the floor. Arthur took a few deep breaths, winding up his strength before he abruptly stopped as his gaze turned to the photo of his father and himself that was sitting on the coffee table. Arthur studied the photo intently with tears in his eyes, as a flash of memories centered on the day of the photo flooded into his mind. Arthur returned his grip onto the tweezers which squeezed down on the worm-like creature attached to his skull as he began to hear the faint sounds of sirens in the distance. Arthur breathed heavily and winced as he gripped down as tightly as he possibly could before yanking just as hard as he had been previously. Arthur pulled with all his might until he felt a huge pressure being relieved from his skull. Arthur's hand slowly fell to his side as his body went limp and collapsed onto the side of the coffee table, causing it and the table's contents to flip onto the ground with a photo of his dad lying next to him.
As Arthur laid there on the ground, facing the photo of his father, he could see the worm-like creature wriggle and twitch frantically behind him as he felt the warm flow of crimson tide slide down the side of his face and pool onto the carpet. It was as paramedics rushed into his apartment that Arthur finally realized something. He could faintly hear the reactions of the paramedics as his vision got more and more clouded, and his thoughts started to drift off into a sea of memories. In that moment, as Arthur lay there triumphant, yet at the same time beaten, his last thoughts drifted on one particular memory he always kept locked up. Arthur gave a weak smile as the light began to fade from his eyes, and the paramedics rushed over to him. The smile he gave was because of the irony of it all.
Everything went black as Arthur remembered the exact day his father had died, and the way he had found his father was exactly the same way. that the paramedics had found him. So, ladies and gentlemen, that was Slither's very interesting story about things that get inside your body. My dear Wanderer Fen, what would you rate that before finding our next tale?
Needs to be edited a little bit for wordiness, but aside from that, quite good.
So, I think a rating 3.5 out of 5 would be good.
Yes.
Not bad indeed. Not bad. Okay, now then, which is the next story you're going to find for us?
One moment. I think this one should work. I don't think we've read this one. It's newer.
I see. Maestro. Okay, well, no surprises.
That's quite a good rating.
I see, okay. Well, no surprises for me. I'm going to figure this out myself. Let's now change the title. The story is called Maestro. Yet another very interesting creepypasta. I am looking forward to this. Right. Would you like to start this one off, since it's a lady's voice?
That's true. Unfortunately, I do not recognize the song, so the tone shall be off if it is an actual
Just go
song.
the way you normally do, my dear.
Then let us begin. On lonely street, on a dark, lonely night, she sang softly to herself as she walked, hands clasped behind her back, clutching her purse. 1,000 glittering lights were bright.
I think your voice is creepier than the song itself.
Exactly.
Right.
Sarah was bored.
Yep, go on, go
This
on.
Halloween had been such a letdown. Her boyfriend hadn't been available to go to any of the cooler parties being thrown, having been grounded by his parents for his geometry grade, and her friends were all busy with their own things, too busy to go party with her, as much as a wild child as she was, according to her father, at the very least. She wasn't as stupid as to go home to some stranger's house alone, especially when beer and hormones were in full use. So here she was, walking home beneath the flickering lights of street lamps after having a horror movie marathon with her two younger cousins at the house, while their parents went out to a party. How fair was that?
Her uncle Mortimer had offered to give her a lift home, as it was well past 2 in the morning, but she declined. She saw past his caked-on white makeup and vampire fangs, and had seen how his eyes were somewhat glassy, and how they were following his wife's every move. She knew he wanted to have some more Halloween fun, and she had no intention of ruining anyone's Halloween night, like hers had been ruined. The lamp above her flickered briefly, a harsh buzzing noise filling the air. Oops, one moment. Yes, a harsh buzzing noise filling the air, as if some large fly were close by. Pausing to look up, she jumped a bit when she heard the sudden shattering of glass, and the tinkling noise that came with such shards falling onto the ground. Looking behind her, she could see that the streetlight 10 poles down had burst. A sudden blanket of darkness rushed over the area, swallowing the street in a pure void.
She calmed herself, knowing that the light had probably just been old, or the wiring was bad. The holiday, combined with the late hour, was setting her nerves on edge. She was merely a block from her house, from her warm bed, and a small nightlight that she had to make her feel out through the dark and stormy night. And then another light burst, a sudden shower of glass, only making itself known as the glass struck the hard concrete, swallowed in velvet darkness. This light was the next one, just after the first. Her eyes widened in fear as she saw the briefest flicker of a wide red eye set back in a pale face. Two slender hands, brighter than the moon on a cloudless night, seemed to hover in the darkness near the face, spidery fingers caressing the very air around him as he gazed at her.
And then the third light shattered, casting the stranger back into the unseen. The last thing the last thing that she had seen of that being was the wicked gleam of his smile, his wide, dark smile, filled with sharpened teeth. Sarah screamed, dropping backward from sudden fright, scrambling to her feet as another 2 lights exploded in rapid succession. The high-pitched buzzing seemed to grow more fervent as she broke into a sprint, but she couldn't seem to outrun the darkness, the ever-expanding shadows that were speeding along, nipping at her heels as the streetlights continued to burst and fade. Every time she looked back, she could see the edge of her encroaching ebon wave of twin-set eyes, blazing like the sun, and her own reflection in its silvery grin, like a demented Cheshire cat from a horrible nightmare.
Over her scream, she could just hear the faintest singing, almost as if a lover was whispering it into her ear. The voice was sickly, high and reedy, and most definitely male.
Ooh, I'll take this one. On a lonely street, it hissed in her ear, another light breaking overhead, plunging her into the very edges of the darkened wave, a long-fingered hand reaching out languidly toward her neck, even as she was sprinting. On a dark, lonely night.
No! She screamed, squeezing her eyes together as not to gaze at those unearthly fingers closing in on her. How was he keeping up with her and speaking so steadily? She could barely breathe, much less sing, and here he was, right on her ass like nothing was going on. She stumbled as she was lifted bodily from the ground, her legs still doing their best to propel her forward in almost a comedic fashion. Opening her eyes, she could barely make out the man's features in the pitch of the night, thanks only to the brilliant glow of his blazing eyes. His head was tilted to the side, like a curious child, as he held her by her shoulders, fingers wrapped fully around her biceps, lifting her episode. There. His mouth, far too wide to be real, was spread back in a sick grin, rows of needlepoint teeth lining blackened.
The song, he said, the words sounding wrong as he spoke around his mouth full of knife, actually ends like this. And before she could even see him, he had lunged forward, jaws snapping wide enough for him to swallow a bowling ball, slamming into her chest, his countless sharpened teeth piercing her like so many needles, ripping through her chest as if she were merely an orange rind with a cute pink baby tea. She swooned as the pain she thought she would feel never came, merely a sense of nausea and lightheadedness, accompanied by the sounds of thick gulping and water splattering on the cold October ground. Not water. It's not raining, she thought drunkenly, her head swaying back and forth as her eyelids became heavy. That's my blood.
Her vision, clouding at the edges, became filled with the blazing orb skin, a long, multi-pronged tongue cleaning the gore from his face in a lazy fashion as he shuddered in apparent ecstasy.
On a lonely street, on a dark, lonely night, 1,000 fangs pierce the girl just right. Her blood he seeks to get his fill. Her flesh and bones seem to fit the bill.
He sang softly, lowering her to the ground gently, like she was a fine piece of china. Her eyes, so heavy with sleep, could just make out that she was lying in a pool of her own blood, and that there were others standing around her, barefoot.
Now she haunts the streets, so ends this tragic tale. But don't be sad for her, for she did not fail. He continued, waving his long arms wide, singing to his new audience. She lingers on to see those who've sung, and pray there will be no more. All the girls around him, some 24 pairs of cold, dark eyes, stared back at him, no smile at his lyrics gracing their beautiful features or any kindness in their gaze. Each bore their own mark, their own open wound from which nothing but rot fell. He smiled at them, doing a deep bow with a flourish of his hands.
"My dear ladies, I would assume you would thank me,"
he said in mock anger, his eyes flashing brightly in the now silent alley.
"After all, everyone loves to make a new friend, and here you go, one who already knew some of my work, a true fan of quality music, wouldn't you agree?"
Yes, maestro, they responded in unison, dead and hollow chorus of sweet tones made all the worse by their utter lack of emotion. The creature leaned back with a satisfied smile, taking a deep and long sniff of the crisp night air, arms held wide. In the darkness, one could hardly see him, save for his near-translucent skin, thanks to his black bodysuit. Tall enough to be considered freakish by any normal standards, the creature popped its back with a pleasant sigh as the young girls milled about him, their glassy eyes watching his every movement. Even hunched over, long, spindly fingers danced across the asphalt. With a hideous crackling of nail on stone, he towered over all of them.
This was only made worse by the fact that he was completely skeletal. His frame was that of a man who hadn't eaten in weeks. Thin cords of muscle moved sickly beneath his pale hands and face, a horrible caricature of life, if studied closely. A bald head, smoothed as if shaven, sat perched atop a high collar, a wide jaw curved up into a prominent chin. Pale, colourless lips pulled back into a shark-like grin, revealing the countless needles that sat aligned within. Sarah's last memory, her last thoughts were those of terror and fear. A chalk-white demon swimming within the shadows of the night that hunted her, stalked her like a wounded deer. He had even played with her as if her life was so measly a thing that he could make light of it.
And then he had killed her, tearing into her chest with his shark-like mouth, singing some old song she had heard played on the radio every Halloween. She had been powerless, completely and utterly unable to do anything to prevent it. Just as she was now, she somehow found herself standing over her own body, her chest looking like a raw hamburger, skin grey and cold as the stone beneath it. Her murderer, as inhuman as she remembered, turned to look up from his position on one knee over her body, a slow smile creeping across his features. "Why?" she asked, not entirely sure what to say. Her hands were at her side, but she could feel the cold wind blowing into her open wound, somehow bloodless and stiff. It confused her. There was no way she could be alive, but on some level, she knew she wasn't.
"Why?"
he repeated, mouthing the words slowly as if he'd never heard them before.
"Why, my dear girl, why not? I heard you as I was on my way home, singing with such a sweet voice, and I knew I had to add you to my choir."
"Choir?" she asked, still too shaken from the surreal experience to even question the crowd of girls standing all around them, all sporting similar wounds across their abdomens and legs, their dead eyes and featureless faces not doing much to ease her nerves.
"Why, yes, my choir,"
he cried, high and loud, waving at the surrounding girls as if they were explanation enough.
"I gather those with talent and make certain their talent does not go to waste due to the ravages of age or sickness. I preserve their greatness and entertain those walking this great masterpiece we call Earth for all eternity."
"Masterpiece of Earth? What kind of nut are you? You freak! Why in the hell would you do this?" Sarah cried, the shock of it all sinking in finally.
"I know, my dear. The transition can be somewhat difficult, but it is really for the best. It would be a crime to allow your dulcet chords go the wayside in the next few years due to something as silly as hormones. Now you can sing like my own personal songbird,"
he crowed, standing to his full height, practically skipping with joy at the thought.
"Girls, be dearies and take my newest instrument home for me. I still have work to do before the concert."
Sarah couldn't even protest at such a command, as her world seemed to melt around her. the darkness of the night giving way to something far more enveloping, a soul-wrenching void she could barely even begin to contemplate before she found herself thrust from it just as suddenly. She now stood in a well-lit ballroom that, perhaps years ago, was made to entertain a crowd of hundreds. Now it was old and worn, vast stretches of masonry cracked, paint peeling in wide stripes. A large stage sat against the far wall, near a pair of double doors, while the rest of the room was filled with old wooden tables, covered in worn silken tablecloths.
Two girls, a small Asian child and an older teen with glassy eyes and a gaping throat wound, stood close by, motionless. The Asian girl bounded over to her, skipping as she went with a wide smile on her face.
You just must be the new performer. Aren't you excited? She asked, her blood-soaked shirt and large torn streaks marring her face, a tad unnerved to look upon. Perform? Why the hell should I perform anything for that monster? He saved you from age and disease, from losing what talents you have. The Maester has been saving us all for the past 300 years. The little girl stomped, her brow furrowed in what would be a cute fashion had a side not be sliced open. Don't mind Mimi, she's still fresh, just like you, interrupted the taller girl, seeming to appear next to her rather than walk. After a few years, as your blood thins out, you'll calm down just like the rest of us.
The girl's flat, featureless tone was almost a breath of fresh air, when compared to the demented cries of the smaller girl, who was now merely pouting at Sarah angrily.
Angela, she needs to understand what we're here for,
Mimi said with a low whine. Maybe I'll take Angela and just see what happens. Angela waved away her concern with a small smile. I'll show her, Mimi. We don't need you throwing a tantrum right now. We just got all the tables set, and we'll need room to appear at its best if we want the Maestro to be pleased with us. That seemed to cheer the tiny spectre up significantly, allowing Sarah to breathe a sigh of relief. Mimi gave one final glare to Sarah, which was only met with a bewildered blink, before vanishing without as much as a puff of smoke. Don't mind her. She seems to be in love with the Maestro. It can happen to you, if you convince yourself all of this was your choice. Angela deadpanned. We're ghosts, as I'm sure you've realized by now, Angela continued, turning to begin sorting sets of polished silver tableware upon the room, plates and knives and forks floating about her head as they slowly drifted to the numerous tables, getting set into a proper position. We are bound to the unseelie that killed us so long as our blood flows through his veins. It takes an average of 10 to 15 years for one of us to fade away into nothingness, less if our beloved Maestro sustains some substantial injuries. It takes blood to heal one of them, you know.
How can you be so calm about all this? Sarah asked, eyes glued to the floating stake life, drifting lazily in the air as Angela decided where it was needed.
Well, I've been bound to the Maestro for about 6 years, give or take. My blood is thinning with him, growing more and more diluted as he takes more in. This is allowing my spirit to ease slowly away from this limbo into the great beyond that awaits us all. Angela explained matter-of-factly, flipping the knife through the air and sending it through the double doors with a sudden flourish. We're bound to him, cursed to roam the world as unnatural spirits, until either he is slain or our blood is used up with him. Until then, we serve him without question.
Why? Sarah asked, walking slowly around one of the finished tables, eyes looking anywhere but the dead woman before her.
Because we have no choice. Any wish he has, no matter how perverse, we must follow through with it. For example, I helped shatter the lights tonight as he was moving in for the kill. Angela said with a careless shrug.
You helped him kill me? Sarah asked, not knowing how to feel at that thought.
Angela shrugged once more, disinterested with the conversation. I and a few others, the older ones. We have far better control than a fresh one like you, so we get the joy of helping him hunt.
So we're ghosts then? Sarah asked, waving hand through a close-by table for emphasis.
The best term is poltergeist, as we can still manipulate the material world if given the proper motivation, but for now, yes, you're a ghost. a vassal to a greater unnatural creature that requires the flesh and blood of the still living to power its very existence. She answered with a flat tone and bored expression etched across her comely features. Maestro is virtually at the top of the food chain in the supernatural world, what most people would call a vampire. He hunts the living, creates servants and thralls from those willing to be bent to his will, and enslaves those he has slain in grotesque ways to provide him entertainment.
Entertainment? Mimi said the same thing a moment ago. What are we going to do? Strip for him and his pervy little friends? Sarah asked, a bit of trepidation seeping into her voice.
Nothing so simple, actually. Maestro is called such because he exclusively hunts and feeds on performers, Angela said, snapping her fingers to whip back a drawn set of curtains, allowing a flood of moonlight to shine into the room. Unlike us, he truly is what he eats.
What? Can't you say anything that makes sense? Sarah asked, jumping back as a trio of mops swished past her, cleaning the floor without any visible direction.
We're merely echoes of what we once were, memories given form by lingering fluids that were once taken from our physical selves. As those fluids thin out, they mix with the fluids of others, altering us until we're merely a shadow of several different people. Their skills, their memories, their personalities, all one rough amalgamation crammed into a spectral form. Angela sighed, shoulders slumping at the very idea. That's why the older we are, the more detached we feel. We can feel our minds being eroded away by foreign thoughts and desires, hopes and dreams. I can't even remember where I was born, let alone where and how I died. All I really want, all I really know, is what the Maestro allows me to do.
Which is, what? How to be entertaining. Because I hate to burst your morbid little bubble, but you're kind of a mood killer, Sarah said with a grimace.
All I know is cleaning and kinetic motion, how to interact with the real world. There are 3 others like me, all with memories of hunters and trappers of soldiers. We help him hunt, help him add to his stable, Angela said, with a faint smile. Most of the other ghosts like you are kept to entertain. He floods your mind with years of musical training, inundates your thoughts with past performances and songs, makes it to everything you are. What makes you, you, is music.
Sarah truly didn't know what to say to such a statement, but on some level she knew it to be true. All she could really remember at the moment was death, a horrible jumble of sensations, all made worse by the pain and terror that had accompanied them. Instead of remembering her birthday, she could now faintly hear a lovely ballad sung in a voice strikingly similar to hers, in a language she didn't know, but was beginning to understand.
It's already started then, as you can tell, Angela said with a smirk, waving a hand elegantly toward the far wall, the strips of peeling paint quickly rolling back up the walls, slowly aligning back into their original shapes, the torn seams vanishing slowly. The thoughts, the memories you knew aren't yours, they're ours. Each and every one of us. Every person slain by the Maestro, every time he's fed on their vital essence. They've been slowly woven into the vast folds that are our mind.
She's hearing the sonata, another voice said, a hollow whispering that sounded as if the wind itself was speaking. Sarah turned to see a frail girl, no, a frail woman, floating just mere inches from her hair drifting lazily around her translucent frame, as if she were suspended in a pool of crystal clear water, her eyes but hollow points of pale moonlight. Skin was old, paper thin and worn. The sonata is what Maestro loves to hear from his newest acquisitions. It's a song from his homeland, he told me. Long ago, the song was sung to warn of the threats that surrounded them, the threats that lurked in this night.
That's Eve, Angela whispered to Sarah just over her shoulder. She's been here the longest, and if what we believe is true, will soon be living us. Finally going to rest after her years of service to the Maestro.
Over 100 years I've sang for him. From every moment he falls to bed, from every moment he awakens. He loves to hear the sonata, in his native tongue, of course. Eve whispered, floating closer to Sarah than she felt comfortable with. The lower half of the woman's body was merely vapor, no visible wounds standing out from her ancient mistakes. You'll be learning it soon enough, dearie. Make no mistake. Thank you, Sarah said awkwardly, not really knowing how to respond to such a statement. She felt a cold wash over her as Eve's hands fell across her cheek. a soft caress of what could easily have been made of ice. So lovely, just like when I was younger, Eve said to herself as she began to fade from view, her voice becoming a mere echo. So lovely.
The time passed strangely for Sarah, with vast tracts of time slipping past her noticed like water through her fingers. Mimi would flutter into existence close by, dragging her through the crushing void to another section of the mansion, or perhaps another home, forcing her to gather supplies that their wayward master would apparently require in the coming evening. As they would return with armfuls of linens and silverware, Angela would tell Sarah to aid another 3 spectres in cleaning the vast kitchens beyond the double doors, a task that proved futile, as she was utterly incapable of doing any such task without the most direct supervision, as her mind was slowly being overcome with thoughts of songs, of notes, and chords, of lyrics and melodies, all things Sarah knew she had never heard before in her life, but seemed to haunt her forever in death. She found herself steered away from the kitchen after a time, trapped in a darkened corner of the house with the vaporous form of Eve watching over her, silently listening as she hummed the very song that reverberated throughout Sarah's mind. She ignored all attempts at conversation, and somehow seemed to have found a way to contain Sarah within the stiflingly dark room, as every time she moved to leave she would find herself seated once more across from her, the same rotting armchair beneath her, with the same broken table between her and Eve. Between the songs playing over and over in her head, the only thing she could really focus on was how her family must be feeling, how worried they must be. Her 2 bratty cousins, her little brother and sister, their faces flashed through her mind's eye, along with the images of her mother and father, and of her aunt and uncle. They know she was dead. It had to be morning already, and with her body left out like that, she could only imagine how horrified they would be to find her. How was the little brother taking it? Her sister, only a baby really, wouldn't be too broken up about it, as she couldn't quite understand death yet. But would she miss Sarah at all? Would she even remember her?
It's almost time, dearie, Eve announced suddenly, her paper-thin voice crackling from the effort it took the spirit to speak. Just know that with all we've gone through, and it gets easier with time. What, performing? I know it gets easier, I think, Sarah said, not really knowing which of the thoughts was hers and which was someone else's.
Eve didn't respond, choosing instead to pull them back into the soul-crushing darkness of the void, and back into the ballroom that Sarah had first appeared in. While it had been well lit before, now the entire place seemed to practically glow with energy, great spheres of light fluttering along the ceiling like fireflies, sparkling whenever they came in contact with dazzling delight. The ancient tables, now covered with more presentable linens than before, were now full of guests, all as disturbing to lay eyes upon as a killer. At least 30 to 40 of the foul creatures sat in the hall, chatting and laughing amongst themselves, though not all were as frightening as the maestro. Some wore their hair in long curtains down their back, elegant ebon cocktail dresses hugging their pale flesh in all of the right places. Blazing red eyes, highlighted by equally bright lipstick, made only terrifying when they spoke or smiled, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. Squat men in tuxedos sat with long-handled cigarettes, chatting with bearded men in robes, while several young-looking children ran about the floor chasing a yipping dog.
The children's wide mouths and flaring eyes almost made Sarah weep for the fate of the dog, but she choked back the sob that struggled to come forth. Eve placed a frozen hand on her forearm to draw her attention, and it was only when she turned did she meet the eyes of her maker.
"There is my little diamond,"
the maestro crowed, dressed in skin-tight black silk, towering above her with eyes a dull glow.
"How is she, dear Eve? Is she ready, you think?"
As ready as one in her position can be, Maestro, but I know that I am ready. Please, let us move on with the show. Eve creaked, moving to take Maestro's offered elbow, which seemed to help her float alongside him as he walked to the edge of the stage they stood upon. The crowd fell silent as the Ibon giant waved for their attention.
"Ladies and gentlemen, I invite you here for my dear Eve's 250th performance with utmost pride and never-ending sorrow. This performance, a piece I have favoured for untold years, shall be her last,"
the maestro announced, a deep sense of loss somehow being sent through his words that the crowd easily seemed to pick upon, as a collective groan rose from them.
Now, let us not taint this marvelous event with such sadness, but instead embrace the new era of my latest talent,
the maestro said, waving the crowd's disgruntled cries away before holding out a spidery hand to Sarah, drawing her close to him.
Tonight shall be her debut upon the stage, as is the custom. Let us aid her in her artistic endeavors.
Sarah didn't even have time to think about what perverted custom he could be thinking of before a sudden whooshing of air followed by a sharp and loud crack broke through the following silence. Dangling some 10 feet away from the stage, and from the rafters high above by a single length of thick piano wire, was Uncle Mortimer, twitching in a macabre form of dance as the last vestiges of blood ebbed from his body. Blood spilling from the sliced flesh of his neck and dripping through his fake vampire costume. A loud cry rent the air from above, and in horror, Sarah watched as her mother and father were pushed from the same rafter by a grim-faced Angela, their screams not screams of mercy for themselves, before their children lined up for the next drop.
Sarah's mouth opened to scream and to beg, but all that came out were the words of that damn song that had been stuck in her head, a solid stream of richly sung French that held all of Sarah's anguish and fear. The song grew louder and louder as she watched her cousins pushed over the edge, followed by her brother, watching their bodies writhe and struggle at the end of a long length of wire, struggle for breath. As the cord cut through their slender necks, and as the blood fell from the bodies and into the hungering mouths of Maestro's guests.
The song reached its crescendo. I'm sorry. I'll take this part.
Worries.
The song reached its crescendo as Sarah caught sight of the maestro walking up onto the stage, cradling the sleeping form of her baby sister. Watching in horror as his mouth grew wider and wider, a veritable bear trap of blackened needles and bleeding gums. The high point came and crashed like 1,000 waves upon the sand as he closed his mouth with an audible snap. Her sister no longer sleeping and no longer there. Now just a bulge in the maestro's throat as it expanded and forced the body of a struggling sibling down into his body. With the song done and her family now swinging softly in an unseen breeze, Sarah could do nothing but stand there as she was given a round of applause by the blood-drenched demons surrounding her, forced to bow to them with blank eyes at the maestro's perverted whim, and to begin the song anew with images of a family dying, flashing before her eyes in a way she could not control or stop. The only thing she knew to be her own within her head was the single phrase she heard Eve say to her, in what Sarah could now tell was an apologetic tone.
Just know that we've all gone through it, and it gets easier with time.
Wow, ladies and gentlemen, that was quite the tale. So that was Maestro. What do you rate this one, my dear wanderer?
I quite agree with the ratings on this one. This one was excellent.
So I would say 4.5 out of 5. Would that be about right?
Quite so.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to our 2 creepypastas today. Next week, we will definitely do more, or we'll do some poetry readings as well. Hope you've all enjoyed it. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And for those of you who want to join me on Twitch for my gaming live streams, the link will also be posted there. And for now, we'll see you all on the next one.